Hi, folks. It's Monday, September 16th, 2024, and I wanted to start this podcast by acknowledging the vibes have changed. Since I released my trailer back on June 3rd, we've had two consequential debates. Biden dropped out, Kamala picked up the baton without missing a beat, and joy and laughter has been infused back into our national discourse. Joy and laughter are really important. You can't be in fear and anger and joy and hope at the same time. Positive emotions are a good disinfectant to the hate-filled rhetoric spewed by MAGA. But while these feelings are so important to our well-being, we also need to do the work. The last few months, I've done postcard parties and phone banks. I've started to walk the talk of this podcast, and talking to voters has reminded me that many, many voters won't hear the democracy message unless we reach out to them. So I ask you, are there people around you that would hear the pro-democracy message from you where they wouldn't from someone else? I invite you to listen, to connect deeply, and then direct them to how the result of this election can lead to better outcomes for their lives. Thank you for joining me on this pro-democracy journey. And now for the interview. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I know I did. Welcome to the Ground Game Podcast. Today we are joined by Katie Fahey from The People, a non-partisan organization that drives political change in our country. I first learned about Katie through her push to end gerrymandering through her successful campaign to pass Proposal 2, a ballot initiative to reform how electoral maps are drawn in Michigan. I'm excited to talk politics with Katie as I have immense respect for what she's accomplished and can't wait to hear all about what she's been up to since. Welcome, Katie.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. You're one of my ground game heroes.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, because I saw your TED Talk and I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is amazing. I really want to talk to this person and tell other people about her too.
Yeah, it still feels surreal to me as well. So love hearing that though.
Okay, excellent, excellent. All right, so let's just get started. Were you always interested in politics?
No, I definitely wasn't. I would still say even now I kind of hate politics in a lot of ways. I like civics. I believe in good governance, all that kind of stuff, but I've always really disliked the us versus them, which has felt pretty prevalent since I've been paying attention to politics. But again, always kind of believed in voting, always felt like, it's our civic duty and it's a privilege to live in a country where we can vote over so many things. But really just always have kind of felt like the rat race is like more distracting than helpful to actually fixing and creating a better country and world.
Yeah, it seems to have become all about the horse race rather than like the facts on the
Yeah.
ground. And it's made politics a bad word, which is
Hmm.
really sad in some ways, but I like your framing of the word civics. That's really good. I like that a lot. I like that a lot. So if you're not interested in politics, but you're interested in civics, what turned you on to civics?
Yeah. So I feel like my dad is a veteran. So ever since I was younger, he was part of a group called the Disabled American Veterans, and we did a lot of just like community work and learning about your country and getting to talk with veterans who'd served in many different conflicts throughout our nation's history. And so I think I just grew respect for what that means and what kind of like sacrifice that is. And um one of the things early on was always like, you don't have to do everything, but do what you can. I think was a common refrain on like, what are the ways that we can give back? What are the things we can give? What's the way that we can live in service and in community with one another? Because we are more fortunate than some people, but also it's just what you do. It's how you live in the world, I guess. And so I think that's kind of what got it started for me, was just growing up like that. My dad also worked for the Veterans Administration, helping homeless veterans. He set up like the first homeless veteran program in Detroit for making sure that veterans could get like their benefits that they were owed. Um, and I think there was something about seeing just the good in that starting to happen, but also like the really big gaps for people to be able to get the resources that they're entitled to and that kind of stuff. And I think that just made me realize like somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to figure out how do we solve these problems, how to make and improve the world, how to help make sure that we're, I don't know, living better in community with each other. So I think from a young age, it was kind of always there. And then I think what made me go from kind of like, I think voting's important. I'll talk to my friends and bug them about issues and want to like make sure they know who the drain commissioners are who are running, to then taking more action, was really just feeling like there were too many injustices, I don't know if that's a word, piling up. And it kind of felt like I felt like I was giving back in my day job. I felt like, I was doing my part, but it also felt like if somebody doesn't start trying to really fix this soon, like I don't know what we're fighting for anymore. I don't know if democracy is going to be worth it if we can't actually get it to be providing basic things. And I live in Michigan, and there was a big crisis called the Flint water crisis. And I'm not
Yes,
sure if
we heard of,
everybody kind of,
yeah, it's so weird. We heard about that nationwide. It was appalling. And yet I still don't really know how it was resolved, if at
yeah,
all has been resolved. News is really great about telling you about the problems, but not telling you like how people are trying to solve it. And I think Gretchen Whitmer was instrumental in trying to solve it, but hardly know. I hardly know.
completely. Yeah. I all of that resonates with me. Yes, it's mostly resolved, although I will say that I feel like the people of Flint still deserve more, like their pipes to be completely replaced. It hasn't really been done, but like the water is more clean now. But particularly at the time when I kind of made that shift, I had an hour-long commute to work every day, and I'd listen to the radio about like Michigan news, and I just kept basically hearing like how out of touch our politicians were with the people. And I kept just thinking like, how is that possible? Like we vote for these people, our votes are supposed to mean we can hold them accountable, but all the stories were like 70% of Michiganders believe in this really common sense thing, yet our legislature refuses to do things about that. And then the Flint water crisis happened, and it just kind of, I not only was hearing about it, I also got to see a little behind the scenes. It was like a bunch of people pointing the finger at each other, talking about who did wrong or who was trying to get credit for like quote unquote fixing it, but actually nobody really taking fixing it seriously. And basically, literally nobody thinking about how could we prevent this from happening again? How did we get in this mess, and how do we make sure it doesn't happen again? And that's where it just kind of felt like I can't keep going to work every day and acting like stuff's normal when there are kids who go to school and can't drink water from a drinking fountain. And they go home, they can't bathe with their water, they can't cook with their water. They're depending on bottled water for everything, and nobody cares, is what it felt like.
Was that the impetus for the proposal too?
A
The
lot of
just,
it,
yes.
yeah. Yeah, and I think looking at the Michigan like political climate too, 2016, the 2016 presidential election, for the first time I was seeing a lot of friends and family just finally start paying attention to politics and like civics, and I was really excited about that. And they were voting for a bunch of different people, and I was more just excited that they actually wanted to talk about it for once. Like we could talk about childcare policies and the drain commissioner and like that kind of stuff. And when I started poking a little bit more, I started to realize it was mostly around people getting really excited about candidates that felt like they were doing something really big and different. Because what I was starting to hear from folks is they just felt like no matter what they did, nothing changed. It didn't matter. So candidates like Bernie Sanders and like Donald Trump were starting to get my friends and family members who normally just kind of tune out politics actually wanting to go and like get registered to vote and stand in line for hours to go listen to people speak. And I think that what again those candidates had in common was that like they were talking about really big like vote for me and I will like overhaul the entire political system, is kind of like what the messages were in very different ways, I will say. But and so what I kept hearing though, or thinking about was like, yes, voting is important, voting for the president is important, but actually, like, local elections are also super important. And there are other ways to, like, quote unquote, overthrow the government that don't depend on just like an us versus them voting for somebody. Like, there's systemic things that are in the way that lead to things like the Flint water crisis. There's a little combination. This is probably way too long of an answer for you, but a little combination of all of that, of kind of like a really major crisis happening locally, like the Flint water crisis, and nobody doing anything about it. And then seeing like friends and family finally be motivated to want to do something, but then like instantly turning on each other, even though I saw that they had like a lot of things in common. Um, and yet like they were more focused on the candidate than like how do we actually fix it.
It was exciting. I mean, 2016 was kind of a political earthquake for a lot of us, and it was exciting for me, at least afterward, to see people get really, really excited and galvanized about politics.
Yeah.
But and they were loving talking about it, and I love talking politics, so I was loving it. But then 2020 happened, and everyone was like, "I'm over it. I can't talk about it. It's too triggering." There's too many families not talking to each other. Like it, yeah. And so one of the reasons I started this podcast is I wanted to talk about it again, but in a constructive way.
Yes,
you know?
that so resonates with me.
Yes. And because I from as a kid, I was a politics nerd. But decided to do a different, work in something different. But I also think that it's sad that all these people got so excited about something and it was just the national level,
Mhm.
but your local school board is more important, your local supervisor is more important, your mayor is more important, your state representative is more important,
Yes,
and
they make a lot more decisions that directly impact you. Yes.
that directly impact us. And even I fell into that trap where I didn't even know that my council member in my city lived down the street from me, who I voted against, by the way, because when I found out what she was for, I was like, no way.
Right.
you know,
Totally.
so
Yeah.
so we all kind of fall into this trap of national politics. But then 2016 came along and I was like, oh no, all the power is at the states. Like you cannot, it doesn't matter if we have the presidency, Congress, and the Senate, or even the like the Supreme Court. If you don't have power at the state level, you do not have power,
Yes,
you know?
totally. Yeah,
And
and I think that's a very similar moment I was having, especially because of like what was happening in Michigan in particular. And like it wasn't just the Flint water crisis too. There were a lot of laws being voted on where the legislature found like a loophole. We have the right for a voter veto in Michigan, where if we don't like a law, you can organize and get rid of that law. We had used that to try and get rid of the emergency manager law, which ended up leading to the Flint water crisis. And then our legislature got really mad that the citizens undid something they wanted to have happen, and they were then trying to make every single law veto proof, basically.
oh wow.
That and it was just kind of like, what? Like that just feels so wrong.
Yeah, these power
And
grabs at the state level that are happening all over the
exactly.
place and don't make front page news. Yeah.
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. And that's where once I started learning about it, I was like, oh no, like why doesn't anybody care? Why aren't we doing something about this? Not realizing at the time that like, maybe I could look in the mirror.
Yeah. We could all look in the mirror after 2016. It was like
Exactly.
a big wake up call for
Yeah.
everybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was the initial like seed of the idea that led to what it led to?
Yeah, so I had remembered learning about gerrymandering in school. I actually have this very weird memory of like, I think it was like fourth or fifth grade, first learning about the concept of gerrymandering, where politicians draw their own voting districts, um, and and draw those districts in a way that give them like more power, basically, or lock themselves into more easily won elections. And um, and I remember raising my hand and asking my teacher, like, if we know that this is bad, like, why doesn't somebody do something about it? And I remember the answer, which all of this is like very funny. I guess it was like destiny in some way that I would end up doing this. But she said, it's just always been that way, which is true. The people who signed the Declaration of Independence in Michigan gerrymandered. That's, one of our vice presidents was Elbridge Gerry, which is what it's named after. But that felt like a really bad reason. Like I've never liked just because I said so or because it's always been that way. I don't think that's like very a very satisfying answer. And then I remember learning about it again in college, but I at a much deeper level and started to connect the dots of like, man, it feels like sometimes our votes don't count as much as they should, and the reality is they don't always count as much as they should. And it also felt like, man, it feels like the system stacked against being responsive to voters, and like, oh, that's the reality that our politicians, a lot of them are insulated from voters being able to actually use their full power in voting them in or out. And so I cared about that, and um was also, I graduated college and had this hour-long commute to work. And you were just talking about how journalism tends to just focus on the problem, which I totally agree. But I happened to have a local journalist who wasn't just doing that. They had highlighted that if we really wanted to fix Michigan and start making it so that we could actually have politicians not ignoring what 70, 80, 90% of the state wanted to have happening, that you'd have to start at this really systemic level with redistricting and with gerrymandering. And, at the time, I didn't realize it resonated with me as much as it did, but I like had gone on social media then, which was like years before I really started an actual campaign. And I had said, like, yeah, doesn't somebody want to help me do something about this? And like nobody even liked it. Like nobody else cared. So I think I kind of had this like feeling like, oh, I'm just like this political nerd who like cares about wonky stuff like gerrymandering and I guess that's just that. But the seed was there, kind of going back to your question. I think the seed was still there of like this feels like such an injustice. It feels like it's really black and white that this is being done against voters, and that ultimately, like one of the core American values I think we share is that voters play this really crucial role in our representative democracy. We have purposely chosen this form of government so that we can have representation, and yet that very core is been being violated by drawing these lines in a way where like we aren't in a community where a bunch of random just people looked at as either blue or red or don't show up, and that's counted on instead of like what our actual wants and desires are. So anyways, I think that kind of planted the seed, but I certainly never thought I would actually do
Yeah, it was kind of like you like put out the call a second time and just have like a completely different reaction? Do you want to
yes.
describe that?
Sure. Yes. So the 2016 election happens, the Flint water crisis is happening, and I'm watching these friends and family members who I was really excited to see for the first time voting and getting excited start to then either be really disillusioned because their person didn't win, or be like really gloatful and like completely disregard that other people had any kind of value because their person won. And it was just like, no, 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 hold on. Like part of why you were so excited is that like we want to fix the system, and like and our job isn't done. Voting for the president is not the only thing we can do. Like we can fix things like gerrymandering. And Thanksgiving was coming up, and my family votes all directions, mostly different directions than I do. And I didn't want to go to Thanksgiving. I was like, I just have seen the writing on the wall. I cannot have another conversation being called evil. Like, I just don't want to do it. And so my like master plan was like, maybe I can trick my family into wanting to talk about gerrymandering instead of who's president. Um,
That's a good plan, actually. And I bet a lot of people can relate to you right now. A lot of
yeah.
people. Yeah.
And so I went on social media and I made a post that was very simple. That was basically like, hey, I want to take on gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to help, let me know. Smiley face, like smiley face emoji. And again, I was hoping that like maybe I'd find one or two friends who wanted to do that too, and we could like find a place to volunteer, and we would like figure out what the heck ending gerrymandering means. Because all I really knew is that I didn't like it and that it was like causing a lot of corruption, but I didn't actually have any idea how to solve it. And so yeah, I was kind of expecting like, okay, I will get this going. I'll do a little bit of research and I'll go to Thanksgiving and see if my family realizes what I realize, which is like, unless we start here, everything's lost. And if you fast forward a little bit, Thanksgiving still sucked.
Oh,
A lot of
sorry.
my friends and family had no idea what gerrymandering was. That's okay. In a couple of years, it would be better.
Yes.
But my immediate family and my immediate friend circle who hadn't traditionally really been involved in politics were still like, I don't know what gerrymandering is. I do not care. But the other thing that happened also was a bunch of random strangers on the internet who I never met didn't know what gerrymandering was. And they also felt like, oh my gosh, that's a great place to start because that will start getting at the systemic issues for why we don't have a responsive political system, which means that all of these issues we care about, which are many, can maybe finally start making some progress here in Michigan. And so, I go to work, make the post before my hour-long commute. I go to work, I at lunch check my social media, and it was like blowing up, but not in like a mega viral way, I will say. But like for me, I have like a normal amount of friends for like my age. Like it was like a lot more engagement than I'm used to. Like most of the time, my political posts again have like nobody liking it, nobody commenting. There are a bunch of comments, a bunch of likes, and a bunch of messages, like private messages to me saying things like, oh my gosh, I have cared about this issue for so long. I'm so glad you're doing something about it. Let me know how I can.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Like one of the benefits of social media. I'm not on social media, but I hear like stories like that. And I was like, I wish social media was like that all the time.
Yeah, it was being connected to people. I think that's
Yes,
the thing that it does differently, that it can be a benefit and can also be a
yes,
negative.
yes. And so that social media post that had, a more than regular response,
Yeah.
how did that lead to like the proposal, all the volunteers who you give a lot of credit to, like all the people who came on board who helped you do so many things and you've talked to
Yes.
about before. I'd like to hear about them. And then 425,000 signatures, like it really like just blew up.
Yes. So I turned to my coworker, Kelly Schulter, while we're at our day job, which has nothing to do with politics. And I'm like, oh my gosh, uh, people are actually responding to this. And I missed this part of the story, but Kelly and I had actually been talking before work. And she was also feeling really distressed at just how negative everything had gotten online. And I had kind of mentioned to her, like, I think we should do something about gerrymandering. And she's like, we absolutely should. And I was like, yeah, or we could just like go hide in a hole. And she's like, no, we must do something. And I was like, okay, you're right. So putting this out, post on social media. So at lunch, I turned to her and I'm like, oh my gosh, like there are other people besides the two of us who actually want to do something about it. And then we kind of had this aha moment where we both realized, like, oh, we don't know what it means to end gerrymandering. Like, we need to Google right now, like, how do you end gerrymandering in Michigan? Because we had no idea. And now we're connected to all of these people, which at the time was probably like a couple hundred, who want to do something. And especially a lot of those messages, because they were saying, like, oh my gosh, Katie, let me know what I can do. I was like, I don't know what to do. Oh no, like instant imposter syndrome, right? But for like valid reasons, because I absolutely did not know what I was doing. But after my quick Google search, I learned that Michigan is one of 26 states that has this thing called the citizen ballot initiative process, which basically means that like you can bypass your legislature. So often legislatures are like one political party in charge who just tries to make all the rules and keep themselves in power, which is one of the reasons why redistricting or gerrymandering doesn't often get solved by legislatures, because they want to keep that power for themselves. They want to be able to
Yeah.
gerrymander.
I mean, for Democrats and Republicans, if they
Totally.
gerrymander while they're in power, they just slide back into their place, because they don't have to, they just engineer the map for those people who are learning about gerrymandering right now. Gary, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, I did not know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And a vice
Yeah,
president.
he did a map that was so strangely drawn, it looked like a salamander,
Mm-hmm.
like in the middle of it. And that's why they called it gerrymander, even though his name was Gary.
Yeah. So
And
originally
it was
gerrymandering. Yeah.
originally Gary, but now everyone calls it gerrymandering. But what it does is it draws the maps in such a way that even in some states, like even though a majority of people are of one party, the other party, if it manages to get power, could get a monopoly on power because of the way the maps are drawn.
Yes.
Because of the way, yes. And so it means people don't need to, none of the seats are, or many of the seats are not competitive. They don't even need to like go and meet their constituents. They don't need to do town halls, and they can still get voted in without being responsive to the citizens in their district because of the way the map is drawn. So it's bad
Exactly.
for everybody, except
Yes.
for the politician who wants an easy ride back into their into
Yes.
their
And
seat.
even if you like the party who's gerrymandering in your state, it often keeps younger and more diverse and candidates with new ideas out of office because it's the incumbents who are drawing the new seats. So they'll see like, oh, maybe I'm a Democrat and there's a Democrat who's running against me who is getting really popular. Oh, I'm going to draw the district differently where they live, where their house is, and make it so that they're going to lose or that they're not going against me. And same with, Republicans do that too. And it leads to basically most elections being decided in the primaries, when it's really just a race of like which Democrat or which Republican, which very few people show up for, unfortunately, the
I think it's
primary.
like 12%. It's very
Yeah.
minuscule. Yeah.
And in some states, independents, which is the fastest growing political ideology, can't even vote in the primary. So you're, having a race be decided by a minority of the voters to begin with, who then choose that candidate who's in a gerrymandered district and then doesn't have to actually fight for your
And
vote.
the largest, I think, I don't know all the numbers, but the largest or voting block is the voting block of people who don't vote,
Yeah.
because they've looked at the world around them and realized, oh, my vote really doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
because of the way things are set up structurally, which
Right.
is kind of makes sense if you have a gerrymandering situation where
Right.
your vote doesn't really matter. So the reason you're doing what you're doing and we're all like excited about it is because then when people vote, it's actually a competitive election, and it's a competition of
Right.
ideas, a competition of people, a
Exactly.
competition to really reach voters.
Exactly. It means your vote counts as much as it should too, like equally, and provides that. And it means that then candidates have to run and be scared of losing the election, which is very important that they're scared of doing because it means they need to keep you, the voter, happy.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, because you go to districts, like I was visiting Arizona over the summer, and I was like, have you ever seen your congressman in this district
exactly.
ever?
Right.
Because
Right.
they don't need to come back to get elected, you know?
And that's what we
So,
started hearing all over Michigan once we started traveling. We would hear people say, you're just like this random person doing this as a volunteer, but like our elected officials have like never visited even once because they just take for granted that we're going to vote their way or not. And it really started making a difference to people because we want that engagement. Again, we have chosen this form of government in America to have representation in our state capitals and in Washington, D.C. It's very weird. Most countries do not do it the way we did. But we were like, hey, no, we want someone to hold accountable and somebody who's thinking about our little part of the world and trying to make sure those voices are heard. But gerrymandering also distorts that because it's taking little random pieces of communities that just happen to be quote unquote red or blue and shoving those together, not really caring what the shared interests are. So
yeah.
as we were kind of seeing that like a lot of people cared about that and we realized there was this ballot initiative process, what we saw is that even if the legislature wanted to keep things gerrymandered, we actually had a way to fight back, which is not always the case, which was really exciting. And what we learned through our Google search was if you could write constitutional language, which we had no idea how to write a law, but okay, if could write a law, then we just had to gather a bunch of signatures. It was a very high threshold. We needed at minimum 315,654 registered Michigan voter signatures in 180 days. And Kelly and I literally did like the napkin math, and we were like, oh my gosh, even if we both quit our day job and gather like signatures every second or awake, if you like timed it out, we were like, it is impossible for the two of us to do alone. But okay, all right. So we have to actually talk to these other people who've responded to us because we can't do it ourselves. But then you could have the people of Michigan vote on it in November when they're voting on all the other stuff. And we would need a majority of those people to vote yes. So we estimated at least 2 million, 2.5 million people to vote yes. But then there was actually that pathway to being able to end gerrymandering. We would just have to write the right law to do that. And what we had seen is that there were a handful of other states who had done that, who had it where the politicians weren't drawing the lines. There's lots of choices for what it was, but at the time, we really saw that an independent redistricting commission made up of just basically like everyday citizens, but representing Democrats, Republicans, Independents, who had really strict rules that they had to follow that defined like what makes a fair district. that was actually leading to really good results, maps that were eliminating gerrymandering, making gerrymandering illegal, which was super exciting.
And I think like this happened what year did this pass?
2018.
2018. And you've just seen like an explosion of activity out of Michigan, political activity since this passed. I mean, it's just remarkable. Like I was one of the reasons that I was still aware of it is like we were interviewing the head of Democratic Party down in North Carolina. Well, not me, but an organization that I follow in North Carolina, um, about how successful things have been in Michigan in terms of voter engagement and what they did, you know. And it was just like the energy was palpable, you know,
Yeah.
and that's what you're looking for in terms of like the health and vitality of our democracy. And I and did the Flint water crisis like really, is it, I mean, is it still in like, other than the like, it's still getting the attention it requires?
I think it could still get some more attention, but
Yeah.
we do have more representation. One of the things that happened is they lost basically their representation in several ways, including their Congress member, who the state just decided, oh, we're not going to replace. And so like a lot of that has been resolved, which is really good.
Mhm.
So we passed the initiative in 2018, and then redistricting happens after the census, because we tried to see like the reason they even redraw these districts is like people move, and you want to make sure that each district has roughly the same amount of population, so that you don't have one congressional member representing like 10 people and another representing a million people. Like that's not fair representation. So anyways, that the lines get kind of redrawn and relooked at in 2021, and 2022 was the first election cycle they were used. And what was really cool is that when we were gerrymandered, the state tends to vote about 50-50 for Democrats, 50% for Republicans. It really just depends on the year, on like who ends up winning and where the excitement is. Like who gets over 50%, I should say that, not who wins. That was the problem. So with gerrymandering, the Democrats had gotten 51% of the vote, the Republicans 49%. So even though the Republicans got 49% of the vote, they actually had over 70% of the seats. So they had like a super majority in one of the houses and a majority in the other house, and then they had the governorship, and they had actually not even had half of Michigan vote for their party while
Right.
gerrymandered. And the Democrats had gerrymandered before the Republicans did it
Yeah,
too.
both
So like
parties
truly
are,
purple, both
yeah,
sides totally do it. But what
yes.
was exciting to see in 2022 is that 51% again voted for Democrats, 49% again voted for Republicans. 51% of the seats went to Democrats, 49% of the seats went to Republicans. Like how people voted was an exact match. It didn't even necessarily matter that Democrats had gotten back in power for the first time in 40 years, and maybe should have been before that because of gerrymandering. They weren't. But like what was really, really exciting is like the voters actually determined the election for like the very first time.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that
that's
brought so much power.
representative.
Yes,
Yes.
it brought so much power. The Democrats who technically could have voted like overly gloated and said like, "Oh yeah, this is all because of our agenda and blah blah blah." Like they were realized pretty quick like we are only barely in the majority and we have to take that really seriously. And from even some of their first press conferences, you were hearing a much different tone. You were hearing like, "We understand we're here from a mandate from the voters, and we also need to be working on things in a bipartisan way." Like you hadn't heard bipartisanship in forever in Michigan. And now they were still following a Democrat agenda because they were in charge. But almost every piece of new legislation being passed was also having Republican support, at least somewhat. And you could hear that tone kind of throughout. And issues that had been kind of put to the side for years, because with gerrymandering, you do have one party in charge, but what you have to remember is because it happens in the primaries, the more extreme part of that party that's in charge, which again is not reflective of the entire population. It's not often reflective of even half of the population. So a lot of these laws that were really common sense, where Democrats and Republicans did agree, they refused to compromise because you would actually have politicians afraid of wanting to compromise, because then an attack ad would be ran against them saying like, in the Republican primary, you have to vote for me because I've never compromised with the Democrat, and this person has compromised. They passed these two laws with the Democrat. Even though the majority of us want bipartisanship. We want to be able to actually have bills that pass and are reflective of the will of the people. That was like the one way you could get unelected. And that has now shifted in most districts in Michigan.
Yeah, that's another word that kind of became a bad word, compromise, like, which was a sign of our polarization, that's a
Yeah,
word that's bandied about a lot. And like, you can see the direct connection between gerrymandering and more polarization, more extreme
totally.
polarization, because the representatives get further and farther apart, and there's no accountability for who from the party gets elected. The most extremes get the attention, get the primary, get the, yeah, it's and then it just doesn't, and then we have the situation at Thanksgiving where people can't talk to each other.
Right. And what
Yeah.
was cool about working on this issue is you had Democrats and Republican voters who all saw that it was important and who are all volunteering to make it happen. Even though some people are like, well, isn't that counterintuitive? Because, some people liked the party that was in charge, but they were still seeing the negative impact of not having a party that was actually listening to them. When you do have folks who are just winning in the primary and they aren't really worried about winning in the general, not only do they tend to be more extreme and therefore like less reflective of the average voter, but they also are more influenced by lobbyists who are just helping give them enough money to make it through the primary. They didn't need to be afraid of losing people's votes. So who are they listening to? People who would give them money to want to vote on different projects. And so many of us had just kind of seen that, like, until we actually get some accountability, until the politicians want to be responsive to us, like, not all of us are sinking in this shared ship. So let's actually get a fair system that works for all of us, which is really exciting to see because I think sometimes between social media and traditional media of watching like talking heads on TV, like it almost feels like, oh, we have absolutely nothing in common. But those core American values about like fairness and wanting a system that works, like I still have seen over and over again that the vast, vast majority of Americans do want that. You just don't hear about it.
And you don't always agree how to get, those
Yeah,
values represented, but yes, we all share those values. And it's better to have representatives who share those values too, in terms of like thinking, giving the other side the benefit of the doubt, that they share
yeah,
the values and that they want to solve these, even if it's coming from a different direction.
you're right.
But is it fair to say that Republican and Democratic politicians in Michigan were unhappy with the map, and that was a good sign?
It is definitely fair to say. So, one of the signs that I took as success is once the maps were drawn by this independent commission in Michigan, both basically Democratic interests and Republican interests both sued them. And I think that why I see that as a good sign is I think both of them thought, like, this map should be more biased towards me. And I think if I sue, we might be able to get them to redraw it to be more biased to give us more of a favor for the Democrat side or the Republican side, which I think again was good. Like it's no matter how people vote in the future, the fact that the voters will be deciding instead of like some lobbyists or special interests or politicians themselves trying to make up and decide for millions of people who's going to be in charge, I think will just keep getting us closer and closer to like the promise of democracy, where we can hopefully be able to like make informed decisions and see what the results are, which we just don't often see in a lot of these races. And now we're starting to in Michigan, which is really cool.
Yeah, is that why the organization was called Voters, not Politicians, or something like that?
Yeah, a big reason actually why we originally started that was because we feel like voters should draw the lines, not politicians. Like voters should decide elections, not politicians. But what we ended up tapping into too was kind of like this populism of people being like, yeah, politicians suck. And we're like, well, we didn't really mean that necessarily, but but we also understand that like that is a sentiment right now for good reason, I would say, is why people are frustrated because so much of the system keeps trying to insulate itself from voters having a say. It's always the parties trying to put their thumb on the scale, special interests instead of just like the actual people whose tax dollars go towards giving these people their jobs, and who like are supposed to be having their interests, everyday people's interests represented in these decision making bodies.
Yeah, I really like the way, even the way the people on the or was it a panel, a committee, a group
Commission.
that yeah, that decides the maps, even the way they were chosen was kind of inspiring actually. Like equal Democrat, Independent, and Republican. And then they also traveled around the state and they talked to people, and there was so much input, and even just their little bios like gave you a little insight into like different people in their communities. And I was like, why aren't more things like that in our democracy?
Totally.
Which is I think a good segue into the people, you know.
Yeah.
So that's the organization you head up right now, and can you just tell us a little bit about it and how it originated?
Yeah. So when I made that post on social media, I had no idea what I was doing, obviously. And a bunch of the people who are volunteering and who we ended up starting to organize, they also had no idea what they were doing. They cared and they knew what, like, they had lots of different types of professions, but none of us had really run a campaign before. And there was a lot of hurdles to doing that, like lots of laws you have to follow to make sure that you can figure out how to break in. Basically the entire political system I learned is like only set up for Democrats or Republicans, and we were trying to be like genuinely nonpartisan. And there's like no software that's nonpartisan. It's like you can get the blue software or the red software, and we had to build a lot of tools from scratch in order so that we could make sure that when we had volunteers from different political stripes, they didn't feel like, oh, if I'm volunteering here, I'm actually secretly helping a party. We really wanted that to not be the case because that's what we were fighting against. Um, and also, I had learned and got to know a lot of the organizations and like more institutional people who do politics every day, who are used to being the ones who do these ballot initiatives or who write the laws or try to stand up for these reforms. And what was kind of sad is like, I felt like, hey, we're bringing hundreds of people, ultimately thousands of new people who want to volunteer and want to help do this. But I learned that that's not normally how things are done. And that a lot of people kind of don't trust volunteers or don't want them to like quote unquote like screw stuff up. And it was really disheartening. Even like the first media interviews we were doing, everybody was like, you guys can't do this as everyday. Like they were like, you don't have millions of dollars, you don't have all these like credentials, like you guys aren't going to be successful. And I was like, hey, like, aren't you supposed to just be reporting the news? Like, hold on a second. And also, like, okay, but our constitution says we can, it says that in Michigan we're allowed to try and use this process, and it's supposed to be designed for everyday citizens to do. So, like, we're going to do that. So, anyways, there's a long way of getting to like we had faced a lot of hurdles, and it really kind of like made a light bulb go off of like, I bet there have been so many other people who are just like me who are like, I want to actually fix this and probably even started. And I feel like in a lot of ways, we just happened to get lucky. We happened to like meet the right person who told us the right piece of information at the right time so that we didn't like accidentally do something extremely illegal or whatever. um, and or like accident or miss a deadline that we didn't know about or whatever. And so I wanted to like pay it forward, of like, let's take the tools we built, the lessons we learned, the connections to the big donors that we made, and like try to make this process easier, not only for people in Michigan but outside of Michigan. When you start something from like a social media post, it makes a really snappy headline, so we're getting like a lot of national news, which was pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie. Like it was like exciting to see people care about Michigan and gerrymandering and like all of us like everyday people just figuring it out together. And a bunch of people from other states had said like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you guys are doing this. Like, let me know how we can do it in our state." And at the time, I was like, "Well, we haven't even been successful yet. Like, I don't know if our advice is good. So hold on a second." And so, kind of after we won and we saw that some of our advice could be good, I really felt compelled to try and like help other folks who were feeling just like me, and who maybe needed a little bit of encouragement or just like some help in that way. So the people started to do that, to try and help everyday citizens come together to create a more accountable and responsive government with everyday people at the center of leading those changes. Because one of the other things I saw was like if we hadn't gone out and reached millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people to let them know what this was and that it would be something new, our solution actually wouldn't have worked. The only way that we got fair districts is you now had millions of people in Michigan for the first time being invited into this process that normally happens behind closed doors. If no people showed up to the meetings of the commissioners, then the people showing up would just be those lobbyists who are trying to put their thumb on the scale, and they
Oh,
wouldn't have
right.
other, yeah, they want to have other input from people and like, what do you want from your community? So it was like really, really important that actually we, the people of our state, like came together to actually pay attention, even though there's like so many other things vying for our attention and that we need to get done. But unless we pay attention, some of these things will stay corrupt. So I was really also feeling like when it comes to these systemic democracy issues, we need everyday people being the ones to solve it. Because if you have pay big special interest people with millions of dollars, the folks I kept wishing would just like step in and fix it, if they actually are the ones to fix it, they're probably not going to fix it in a way that fixes it long term. It's probably going to be more for a short term benefit instead of really looking out for like the people. So the people, we started that organization to kind of like, yeah, reach out to folks across the country to help with navigating the ballot initiative process. If you don't live in a ballot initiative state, how do you pass laws or participate in processes like redistricting in a way that will get a more accountable system. So beyond just redistricting, though, like redistricting, looking at the primary system, looking at um, uh, money in politics, looking at ethics reform, like anything that kind of has to do with the system of government, we try to help with, or voting.
This makes me think about something that I've thought about the last couple of years, which is how the system, the way it's developed now, really encourages people to be on the sidelines, to be spectators, to be
Yes,
consumers, and not to think of ourselves as citizens.
yes,
And as citizens, that we have like a duty and an obligation to work for our country. And I mean, we voting, and then there's jury duty, but there should be more than that to being a citizen, right? And
yeah,
that this idea that it only belongs to professional class of people who should be doing politics and not the amateurs. It should all be amateurs.
yeah,
But because amateurs, they do what they love, and we should all love to do something for our country because we love our country. So
yeah,
um I, it's one of the reasons I want to approach this from like the ground up rather than, because there's this class of people who are professional politicians and
yes,
commentators. And don't get me wrong, I listen to them. I got to get a lot of information from them, but they're not interested in the ground game. They're not interested in the people who are doing the work, knocking on the doors, making the phone calls, writing the postcards, like making the artwork to put in their yard. Like they're like
yeah,
the all the different ways. And I'm sure there's so many other ways that we haven't even thought of ways to express our patriotism and our love of our country, and just how we want to live in a country that, well, this brings up another concept, like another thing, like this thing of keeping people out, keeping people on the sidelines.
yeah,
It engenders distrust in the
yes,
system.
totally.
And how do you think the people and the work you're doing is helping to foster more trust? Because high trust societies like Denmark, like
Hmm.
they're happier societies. They have higher
Yeah,
voter, they have higher voter, people more, like the biggest group in our country is the ones who don't vote, not the Republicans or the Democrats, or the independents who vote, but there's a massive group in our society who don't even vote.
right.
So, and that's probably distrust, like they don't believe their
Yeah.
vote matters. So how's the people addressing that? How do you think your work is addressing that? And talk a little bit about, you know, in your work, from your perspective, why you think it's important.
Yeah, yeah. And I on the last point you were making also, I just wanted to it made me think of that we are also the people who are living with the problems, and a lot of time that political class is a little insulated. If you're on network TV, you're probably not in the community that doesn't have clean drinking water. And
or the community who can't afford a house. Like I can't afford a
right,
house in
right,
my where I live. I've never been able to afford a house, right? Like I'm so
right.
excited about all these things, all these YIMBY things. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll be able to afford a house. You
Yes,
know?
exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
that's why I think like that that intrinsic motivation to actually want to solve it for the long term rests most with the everyday people who are most impacted by these problems, which is why they absolutely need to be in the room. But I also would say like in more of the driving positions, because like they have the most at stake to gain and we live with the consequences of the brokenness. um but yeah, this, you know, starting with redistricting, the way the current process happens is it's behind closed doors, usually by just like a handful of lobbyists. It's not even usually the general population, politicians. Most of the politicians don't even get to actually see their maps, or they'll get to see only their map and have a little bit of input, but then they're sent out by the party out of the room, and it's done behind closed doors. And like, then you just get a list of census tracts to vote on. You don't even actually see a map, and they're voted on, and then they're just put into place. And so the lack of transparency, the lack of drives very little trust, because you can't even know why decisions were made. And so I think it opened my eyes a lot to like how we were running our campaign was full of transparency. It was full of trying to rebuild that trust. You know, we were also a group of internet strangers who were just meeting for the first time, and like who knows who everybody else is on the internet. Like your profile picture is a cat. Like I have no idea if you're like a cat or like somebody from a different country or actually a person who lives down the street from me. I don't know. And so like trust was kind of at the forefront of everything we were doing. And what I started to see is like it made sense that people were distrustful, because a lot of the people in power were distrustful people doing distrustful things. Not like everybody in general, but like they were misleading the public. They felt like, oh, the real answer to the question somebody's asking is too complicated. So I need to just wind it down into one little sound bite, which like people could tell was a lie and like all that kind of stuff. So with the people, part of what we try to do is not only change the laws to make it so that it's a more open, transparent process where you can track it the whole way, like with redistricting, where now our independent commission can only meet in public. Everything they do has to be recorded, has to be shared. People have to be able to see it in real time. Again, complete opposite of what it used to be. So, like, you're changing those laws, but how you change the laws matters too. So, when we were deciding how the heck are we going to write this law, we went across the state and held town hall meetings where we talked about like, what is gerrymandering, what does it look like in our state, what does it look like in other places, and like, what do you want? And a lot of people came in being like, oh well, this person's a Democrat, so there's no way they believe in fairness. This person's a Republican, there's no way they want my vote to count equally. And then they'd start having a conversation about, okay, well, how would we design this system? And you would start people saying like, I can't believe we agree. Like that, what you would hear that all the time. People would just be so amazed. And what I learned later is that this is a concept that's used in a lot of European countries, like a lot more commonly than ours. So it's not the exact same match, but there's a concept called the citizen assembly model, where you bring together a representative group of citizens to look at a problem. So like ours was like redistricting, and you help them learn about all the details and all the facts, which we had to do in order to write a constitutional amendment. And you let them talk to each other, talk to experts, whatever, but you leave them in charge of the decisions and make recommendations. And what you see is that those recommendations are usually way better than what politicians would make. But also, you have this group of people who've really grown a lot of trust from each other. And they also then can provide that really clear example to other people, their fellow citizens, who are like, what? That's just my neighbor. Why are they making like national policy for the country? But you can create that trust with people again, because they can see and deliberate and understand why decisions were made. Participatory budgeting is another like popular concept like that, where like folks come in and like, you know, a community is faced with a really hard problem, like they don't have enough money to keep their schools open, but people want schools open. And a mayor won't want to raise taxes because they feel like they can't get reelected. But you have the citizens come into place and talk to each other, and they maybe make different decisions and things that the city wouldn't have, and maybe they are willing to have their taxes raised because they actually have transparency, they have insight into why the decisions are being made. So anyways,
Yeah, because if
at
you
the
know,
end,
if you look at the
yeah,
books and you're like, oh, I know my taxes are going to this school,
right,
then you're like, okay, yes, you can raise my taxes.
Right.
But if
And
you
then when
don't
you start to see
know,
like,
yeah,
yeah, and when you start to see like, why are we paying, $700 for a dog drinking fountain, which might be fine, you might like that thing, but like whatever it is, whatever the thing, and they can decide to cut it, it adds more accountability to the politician who felt like their pet project, like literally for a pet, I guess in this case, like wasn't as important. So anyways, at the People, my organization, one of the things we've been doing is kind of helping people along that process. How do you get people who vote differently, look different, live from different parts of the state, whatever, but can help represent a community, get in the room together to actually learn about a problem and learn about some of the solutions and be able to create their own solutions. We just held a statewide citizen assembly in New Hampshire because one of our volunteers had been like, hey, I'm in politics and it feels horrible. Like, this is not what I signed up to want to do. Like, I think we need to bring like one of these really intentional processes here to start solving problems. And those folks came together and they came up with policy recommendations on how to reduce polarization in their state and increase accountability from the government. And there's some really great policies, including ending gerrymandering and reforming the primary system and increasing voter education that those citizens came up with and are now working with their politicians to get implemented. So it can help people with that bridge building part, like how do you talk to each other, and then that problem solving part of like how do we even understand what the heck redistricting is, and like and learn about are there ways to improve it or whatever the issue might be, and then helping them take action on that too. Because I think that's the other important thing. So many of us, like we've got really busy lives. We're dealing with lots of real world issues, or even just wanting to like go enjoy, uh, you know, watching Netflix or whatever. Like, we want to live our life. I don't want to just go talk to talk, but taking that action and really feeling like we can make a difference in our government.
that's amazing. Because I was wondering what the New Hampshire project was about, and that gives me a really good picture. And I'm excited to see how that unfolds over the
Yeah.
years. So how do people find the group? And then I saw on your site that you had like voter resources. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so thepeople.org is probably the easiest way, but you can also like email info@thepeople.org. Or we're on like all the social media things, I think too, which I think is like the People or the People org. We're our little logo looks like a little American flag. And we're like, yeah, sure, that's a good logo. So if you're looking for us, that's the one, because it is a kind of common name. And if you go to thepeople.org/elections, I'm pretty sure that would be like if you're looking for election resources, one of the best things you can do. We have a really cool program called Operation Vote America that was actually looking at trust, which I know you just brought up, because a lot of distrust has been sown around our election process, and a lot of politicians are like looking at like how can I make people not trust the election results so that like maybe I can get into power, kind of thing. And there's this concept called pre-bunking, where if people can actually learn about the election process first, they're less susceptible to lies about the election process. And so we did like we made a bunch of videos like around like what's an audit and why does it matter and when does our state use an audit, which sounds kind of like dorky, I would say. But what we started seeing is that when people clicked on one of those videos, they wanted to watch all of them. They wanted to then see like, okay, how does my voting machine work, and what can I wear to the polls on election day, and how do I get registered? And like we started to see that people are actually really hungry for just like basic 101, how do our elections work here in America. So those videos, they're mostly from Michigan, Arizona, and New Hampshire right now, but we're looking to expand them all the time if anybody wants to volunteer on that. Or you can make like your own version and we can help you do that. But all of that can be found on our website or by signing up. We have committees that meet on different topics, especially around things like voting, or if there's different specific reforms that you're interested in. We've got lots of different programs or campaigns we can connect with too.
Oh, that sounds so excellent. Like I just saw a documentary on PBS by Margaret Hoover on counting the vote. And it was fascinating. Like she talked to a lot of voter officials in different, mostly battleground states about what their laws were, because the laws are so different from state to
Yes.
state. So you understand why we don't have an election result at 9 p.m. on election day.
Right.
A lot of laws require that you only start counting on election day. And
Right?
so you have all these mail-in ballots and they have to be like taken out of the envelope and checked and put in machines. And it takes, and then that's why you have poll workers there at 2 a.m., but you won't know
Right.
that unless you knew what the rules were, you know?
Exactly.
Uh,
Exactly. I
so
definitely think too, like watching documentaries like that is helpful. And almost every election official I know, like right now is a very busy time, but like if you haven't gone on like a tour or heard them talk about it, like usually or before election days, like your local, every state looks different, but like for us, it'd be like our county clerk is like hosting some like open houses where you can come and see how like what the voting machine and what it looks like. And I highly recommend doing it. I think it like you can ask any question you want and like it does help you build trust and understand like where there could be improvements too in our election systems. But it's definitely worth looking into if you're interested in
yeah, there was a recount in North Carolina a bunch of elections ago, and I sent my
that.
friend in North Carolina to the recount. I was like, I can't be there, you go. And she went
Yeah.
and she got the tour and she saw them recounting votes because I think that election came down to like 400 plus votes. It was for the
Wow.
Supreme Court Justice of the state, came down to
Wow.
400 plus votes. And she's like, yeah, it was accurate. Everything I saw was on the up and up. And she was there while they were recounting,
Right. Right.
so
And a lot
so
of places now even have like live streams or like videos of it happening too. You just have to actually look and look it up. And pretty much every state I've heard of, like they test the machines beforehand and they'll do that as a public test that you can attend. But they always, like election officials always laugh because they're like, all these people care about whether it's safe or not, and nobody comes when we come
yes.
and do these tests, and they're open to the public. So I highly recommend, like, it is totally fine to have healthy skepticism, but like go and check it out then, because that you will get your answers. And you can also, elections are ran by us, like the everyday people. So like volunteering to be a poll worker, or you can be a poll observer in some states to like make sure that the rules are being followed and stuff. But like all of those positions are desperately needed.
Do you have some of those links on your site, the
We
people for
do, we
poll workers
do.
and observers and things like that? Oh, that's great.
Yeah, yeah. And if you
Mhm.
want to do that and you're not sure how, even by just looking at the links, like we have a voting rights committee that meets and they'll help you walk through that and probably even get you connected to your local officials. So,
Oh, that's amazing.
yeah.
This is like inspiring me to do another episode. Like maybe I'll go and do a tour in my county and then I'll do an
Yes.
episode about it.
Interview a clerk if they're willing. Totally. I know
Yes.
some in Michigan that probably would be. Yeah.
Yes,
They,
yeah. Just to see
it's,
what it's about, just because so much of the information we get isn't based on any kind of factual, observable
yeah.
information,
And
and
it really helps you appreciate how much work goes into like these elections and the processes. And in New Hampshire, when we held that citizen assembly, we brought in, the secretary of state, like some of the people who work for that office, and they brought in like one of each type of voting machine they had, and people could like cast ballots, including trying to like break the machine by like trying to do like a fraudulent ballot. And it was really eye opening for so many people to actually like understand. They were explaining like how the light bulbs in the machine work and like how that helps read stuff, and like the newer machines and what that means. And like, there a lot of these election officials know way too much, like way too many details about all of this, but it can be really insightful and interesting. And the other thing I think, if you're ever looking for inspiration around like re- relationships between people who vote differently, in order to run elections, you need Democrats and Republicans to come and show up and be poll workers. Like often you have to have both of them checking off every step. You need a Democrat and a Republican checking off like, yes, this was followed, yes, this was followed. And the clerks will know the people who've been doing it for 20, 30 years, who have built these long relationships where they still vote polar opposite, but they have so much trust and respect for each other because they follow that integrity of the election together.
yeah, because we're all in the same country. We're all in this together, even if we
Yeah.
disagree about a lot of things, we got to live with each other, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And again, there's people who are like watching the process from both sides who want to make sure it's fair and just for you. And that's, I often think, a little bit more inspiring than a lot of the rat race stuff of politics.
Yes, the horse race. Yeah,
Yeah.
the like who's
Yeah, the horse
ahead,
race.
who's
Yeah.
in the polls. And the polls are not even very good indicators a lot of times. There's so many other indicators that get ignored. But
Yes.
I know your time is very valuable, but I wanted to make sure we got in this one last question
Oh, sure,
before
sure.
we wrap it up. Or of course, do you have anything that you want to say before the last question or?
The one thing I'll say is like, there's so many different things that deserve your attention. And so if you're somebody who's trying to figure out like what's the one thing I'm going to start doing or helping with, like you can't really go wrong, I would say. And making the step to actually do something, I think is one of the most important things you can do. And not letting yourself get distracted by the new headline and the new thing to be upset about every day. Like passing and ending gerrymandering, we did it actually relatively quickly compared to a lot of other places. But from the kind of November, December 2016, it not actually making it to the ballot till 2018, the first election where the new maps are being drawn, not until 2022. Like this stuff takes time, but the only way that these changes happen is by people being willing to stay committed to making it happen. And the other thing I'll say is like, it is not, I get a lot of credit because I like ran it and was the person who made the post and ended up being the campaign manager and stuff. But like it was only possible because thousands of us were willing to do what we could. And for some people, that was like making a donation one time. For other people, it was like designing a giant redistricting statue that we could put at like an art fair. For other people, it was gathering signatures every single day for 110 days, as many as they could. But it looked different, but the only way we were able to be successful is that there were literally thousands of us willing to do what we could, willing to donate money, time, creativity, whatever that was. And I really think that's the only way we get out of this mess is if enough of us are actually willing to take that next step and do what we can. And that can look really different. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to look the same on what that means, but it does really take active involvement and us showing up and caring and fighting for these changes. And sometimes it can feel like really overwhelming. Like, what can my one little, you know, helping hand do? Or is this problem way too big for us everyday people to actually solve? But we got into these problems because of everyday, well, maybe not everyday people, but because people have slowly made them our problems. And the way we even became a country was just because a group of people decided that they wanted to fight for something different. Part of our heritage, it's part of our responsibility. And I just hope everybody who's thoughtful and already doing one part by listening to a podcast like this, but just remembers that, you know, even if it's not 100 hours a week you can give, your 1 hour or even your half an hour really does add.
Yeah, I mean, every little bit counts. I mean, it's amazing to me, like if enough people give that tiny bit, you know,
Mm-hmm.
or if they just, think about it on their commute. Like think about what you can do
Yeah.
when you're commuting or when you're going to the grocery store if you're working remote like I do now. Like just maybe think about the issue, like not just listen to the radio, but think about,
Right.
okay, what's this one issue? Maybe I can be a part in solving it.
Right.
And just think
Exactly.
about it. Give your brain the question and see what it comes up with, you know?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Um, but the last question I want to ask, I was really inspired by a quote from E.B. White during World War II, where he was asked, um, what does democracy mean to you? And his answer was great. And I'm going to put it in the show notes. But I just wanted to ask you, Katie, what does democracy mean to you?
Oh, it's such a good question. I think democracy to me means hope. And why it means that is thinking about all of us as human beings being created equal has always really resonated with me. And democracy is a way to actually live our lives that way. And what we have right now is not that perfect model. I'm not trying to say that it is at all. But the promise of democracy, the fact that we as fellow citizens could make decisions for ourselves, not need a king or an upper class or somebody to have to rule over us, but actually that we could come together and struggle with what's hard and take the diversity of our opinions and actually make a better solution than any one of us could have created on our own. Like that promise of actually solving problems and living more free, truly. I think if again it was more of like a democracy that can live up to that promise, I really think it means hope to me. And one of the things throughout my own personal journey has kind of been thinking about, like, is democracy worth it? Like, I've asked myself that question so many times, especially when, like, we had all of these like millionaires who were fighting against us. I have like student loans and like, I wasn't a secret millionaire who could just fund us to be able to compete on that front. So it kind of always felt like, yeah, the game is still rigged. Like, is it worth trying to not give up on this? And like every step of the way, what I've continued to see, regardless of what state I'm in, what part of the country, is just like there are so many good people out there who are willing to fight for something greater and fight for a more just world, and for one that is worthy of hope and that creates hope. And so I think at the end of the day, when I think of like what democracy means to me, it's like the promise and hope of humanity, that we really deserve to be here and coexist and have self-government.
Yeah, yeah, because I think it gets forgotten. That's why I'm asking the question. I think
Yeah.
it's not inevitable that we have a democracy. We have to fight for it, and we have to fight for it every generation. And like, why are we fighting for it? So I think everyone has to find their own why. What does democracy mean to them? And I just love E.B. White's response to that. I'm going to put that in the show notes for folks so they can read it, because it's he's just such a poet about it.
Yeah.
But it means different things to different people, but it's still worth fighting for, you know.
Right. Totally.
Mhm.
That's the other beautiful part of it, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I so enjoyed talking politics with you, Katie. Thank you
Yes, me
so much for
too.
this conversation. And I look forward to hearing more from, volunteers from the people who I
Yeah.
hope to interview in the coming weeks. I'd love to hear more about
Yeah.
New Hampshire and what they did there, because that sounds amazing. And to our audience, I just want to remind you, please remember your values, your voice, and your vote matter. One citizen can make a difference. And who knows, you too may come up with the idea that sparks a movement. And if you haven't already, check out your voter status at iwillvote.com and remind friends and family to check as well, because the health of our democracy depends on you. Thanks for listening to the first episode of the Ground Game podcast. I invite you to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or subscribe to my Substack newsletter to get notified when a new podcast drops. If you want to reach out to me with thoughts, questions, or pro-democracy folks you believe should be interviewed, you can email me at thegroundgamepodcast@yahoo.com. I look forward to hearing from you.